She scraped the last spoonful of lard into the skillet, sliced one hot dog into 6 pieces, and called it supper. What would you have made from nothing? This was the kitchen table of the Great Depression, the years between 1929 and 1939, when nearly 1 in 4 American workers had no job at all, and every ingredient had to justify itself. Homemakers were not just cooking, they were performing daily arithmetic, turning pennies into meals that had to stretch across a whole family. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart. Today, we are walking through 30 of those dishes, the real ones, built from almost nothing. Before the crash of October 1929, most working-class kitchens were already frugal by habit, not by headline. Root cellars, home canning, and using up every scrap of a roast were simply how a household ran. What changed after the crash was not the philosophy, it was the intensity. The same skills that had always existed in the kitchen were suddenly the only thing standing between a family and an empty table. The first dish nearly every family knew was called Hoover Stew, a mocking name aimed straight at the president many blamed for the crash. It was thin on purpose, a broth stretched with macaroni, canned tomatoes, whatever vegetables were on hand, and a few sliced hot dogs if the budget allowed. Relief camps and transient rail workers served it by the vat. It was not meant to be memorable. It was meant to fill a stomach for as little money as possible. Poor man's meal earned its name honestly. Sliced potatoes and onions, fried slow in bacon grease until the edges turned dark gold, with a hot dog or 2 cut into coins if there was meat in the house at all. It cost almost nothing, and it filled the kitchen with a smell that made a family forget, at least for 20 minutes, how thin the week had been. Clara Canucciari, who grew up in an Italian-American Depression household, would later share this exact dish on camera, decades after she first learned it, standing beside her own mother. Milk toast sounds almost too simple to count as a recipe, and that was the point. Toasted bread set into a shallow bowl, warm milk poured over it, a pat of butter, and a spoonful of sugar if there was any to spare. It was often served to children and to anyone feeling poorly, a soft, warm thing that cost pennies but felt like being taken care of. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, that comfort did not require expensive ingredients, only attention. Mock apple pie is one of the strangest and most beloved dishes of the era, made without a single apple. Crushed crackers stood in for fruit, layered with sugar, cinnamon, butter, and a touch of cream of tartar to sharpen the flavor into something tart and familiar. The recipe actually first appeared on a cracker box in the mid-1930s, but it spread through kitchens because it let a family taste something close to a real dessert without spending on fruit that was out of reach that season. When there was no fruit at all, some households turned to water pie or vinegar pie, a filling made from little more than water, sugar, flour, and butter, with vinegar added to mimic the tartness of a fruit filling. It sounds impossible until you understand the goal was never to fool anyone completely. It was to give a family the shape and ritual of a fruit pie on a Sunday when a fruit pie simply was not going to happen. Depression cake, sometimes called wacky cake, solved a real problem, a cake recipe with no eggs, no milk, and no butter, 3 ingredients that had simply vanished from many pantries. The trick was chemistry, not cleverness. Vinegar and baking soda reacted together right there in the pan, producing enough lift to make a genuinely moist, dark chocolate cake. This same reaction would carry straight through World War II rationing when it earned the nickname Crazy Cake in kitchens all over the country. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Most of these recipes were never written in a cookbook at all. They lived in a woman's hands, taught silently at the stove, passed from mother to daughter with no measuring cup in sight. Decades later, when the Works Progress Administration sent writers out to interview ordinary Americans, many homemakers had to reconstruct their own family recipes entirely from memory because not one of them had ever been set down on paper. Chipped beef on toast, later nicknamed SOS by soldiers who ate a version of it in the army, started as a depression stretcher years before the war. Dried, salted beef was cheap because it did not spoil, and a small amount could be torn into a white cream sauce and ladled generously over toast. One package of beef could stretch across a family breakfast for several mornings, which mattered enormously when meat of any kind was the most expensive item on the list. Beans and cornbread were about as close to a universal depression meal as existed anywhere in the country. Dried beans cooked low and slow for hours, with a small piece of salt pork for flavor, served alongside a skillet of cornbread baked in bacon grease until the crust turned deep brown. It was cheap. It kept a family full for the whole evening, and it required almost no cash outlay beyond the beans and cornmeal themselves, both of which could often be bought in bulk. Cornmeal mush was breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner in many households, cooked into a thick porridge and eaten hot with whatever sweetener was on hand. What made it stretch even further was what happened to the leftovers. Poured into a loaf pan and left to set overnight, the cold mush could be sliced the next morning and fried in a little fat until the outside turned crisp, then topped with syrup. One pot of mush quietly became two separate meals. Foraging was not a fringe activity in the 1930s. It was ordinary spring practice, especially in rural and Appalachian households. Dandelion greens, picked young and tender from the yard before they turned bitter, were wilted with a little bacon grease and vinegar into a warm salad that cost nothing but the time it took to pick them. Lamb's quarters and other wild greens filled the same role, a genuinely free vegetable that showed up on the table every April and May. Potato soup carried more households through winter than almost any other single dish. Potatoes, an onion, a little milk if the family had a cow or could afford it, water if they could not, and salt were often the entire ingredient list. It cooked in one pot on the back of the stove for most of the afternoon, and it asked for almost no attention, which mattered on a day when a woman was also mending clothes, tending children, and stretching every other chore across too few hours. Cabbage and noodles, a dish with roots in German and Eastern European immigrant kitchens, became a depression staple across much of the Midwest. Shredded cabbage fried slowly until it caramelized at the edges, tossed with egg noodles and a generous amount of butter or bacon fat. Immigrant communities in cities like Chicago and Cleveland had been stretching cabbage this way for a generation already, and the Depression simply pushed the technique into wider use across neighborhoods that had never cooked it before. Meatloaf became a Depression institution not because it was a beloved family recipe passed down for generations, but because it was the single best way to make a small amount of ground meat feed a large family. Oats, breadcrumbs, or even grated potato were worked directly into the meat, sometimes doubling the volume of the loaf without doubling the cost. A half-pound of ground beef that might have fed 2 people suddenly stretched across a family of 6, sliced thin and served with gravy poured over the top. Mock chicken legs might be the cleverest piece of Depression-era stagecraft on this entire list. A whole chicken was a luxury many families saved for Sunday, if they could afford it at all. So home cooks took ground meat, often a mix of pork and veal scraps, molded it around a small wooden skewer, and shaped it to resemble a drumstick before breading and frying it. Set on a plate, it looked like the real thing. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget how much effort went into a single believable illusion. Scrapple came out of Pennsylvania Dutch country generations before the Depression, but it fit the era perfectly because it wasted nothing at all. Cornmeal and pork scraps, the odds and ends left over after a hog was butchered, simmered together and set into a loaf pan to firm up overnight. Sliced thin and fried crisp the next morning, it turned parts of the animal that had almost no market value into a hearty, filling breakfast that could feed a family for days from a single loaf. Liver and onions was not a punishment dish in the 1930s. It was simply smart shopping. Organ meats like liver, kidney, and tongue were far cheaper than muscle cuts because middle-class shoppers avoided them, which meant a resourceful homemaker could feed her family real protein for a fraction of the price of a roast. Sliced thin, dredged in flour, and pan-fried with a generous pile of sweet caramelized onions, it became a dish many families genuinely requested long after the hardest years had passed. Tongue and kidney found their way into slow-simmered stews for the same reason liver did. They were the cuts nobody else wanted, which made them the cuts a thrifty family could actually afford. Cooked low for hours with root vegetables and a little flour to thicken the broth, the tougher texture of these cuts softened completely, and the flavor turned rich and deep. It required patience more than money, which was often the only currency a Depression-era kitchen had in abundance. Boston-style baked beans, sweetened with molasses instead of the sugar many families could no longer afford, became a Sunday tradition that could stretch across an entire week. A pot set in a slow oven for most of a day, dried beans softening in a dark, sticky glaze of molasses, a little salt pork, and mustard if the pantry allowed it. Because it reheated well, one large pot often became Sunday dinner, Monday's lunch, and part of Tuesday's supper as well. Egg and bread soup was one of the simplest ways to make 2 eggs feel like an entire meal. Beaten eggs stirred into hot broth until they formed soft ribbons, poured over torn stale bread in the bottom of the bowl to soak up the liquid and add substance. Italian-American households in particular carried a version of this dish straight through the Depression, and it remained a comfort food in those families for decades, long after eggs stopped being rationed by necessity. Fried Bologna sandwiches feel almost too modern for this list, but processed lunch meat was already an affordable staple by the 1930s, and frying a slice until the edges curled and crisped turned a cheap ingredient into something that tasted like it deserved more credit than it cost. Between 2 slices of bread with a little mustard, it became a lunchbox standard for children walking to school and for men carrying a pail to whatever work they could find that week. Bread pudding existed for one reason: stale bread was never thrown away. Torn into pieces and soaked in milk and beaten egg, sweetened with whatever sugar or syrup was available, spiced with cinnamon if a family still had a tin of it in the cupboard, then baked until the top turned golden and slightly crisp. It transformed what would otherwise have gone to waste into a dessert, soft enough for the youngest child at the table, and filling enough to count as a real course. Rice pudding worked on the exact same principle as bread pudding, turning a cheap pantry staple into something that felt like dessert. Rice simmered slowly in milk and a little sugar until it thickened, sometimes with a beaten egg stirred in at the end for richness, a dusting of cinnamon or nutmeg on top if either was still in the house. It could be stretched across several days, served warm the first night and cold from the icebox for the rest of the week. Canned salmon was one of the great budget proteins of the era, shelf-stable and often cheaper per meal than fresh meat of any kind. Mixed with breadcrumbs and a beaten egg, formed into patties, and fried until the outside turned crisp and golden, it stretched a single small can into enough croquettes to feed a full table. Families that lived nowhere near an ocean still relied on canned salmon regularly because it traveled well and kept for months on a pantry shelf. Creamed peas on toast turned a small can, or a modest garden harvest of peas into a full supper. A simple white sauce built from flour, butter, and milk, thickened together in a saucepan, folded in with the peas and spooned generously over toasted bread. It was quick, it used almost nothing, and it was the kind of dish a woman could put together in 20 minutes after a full day of work, ironing, or tending a garden that was doing double duty as the family's grocery store. In parts of the rural South and Appalachia, fried cornmeal mush was topped not with maple syrup, but with sorghum, a thick, dark syrup pressed from sorghum cane that grew easily on a small plot of land. It cost a family almost nothing to produce their own supply for the year, and it gave the humble fried mush a deep, almost molasses-like sweetness that many people who grew up on it never stopped craving long after they could afford anything else. Nothing captured the spirit of Depression cooking quite like a pot of vegetable soup built entirely from what was left over. Bones from a previous meal simmered for hours to pull out every bit of flavor, then whatever vegetable scraps had been saved through the week, potato peels sometimes included, went into the same pot. It was less a recipe than a habit, a running pot on the back of the stove that a woman simply kept adding to, meal after meal, until it was gone. Johnnycakes, simple cornmeal griddle cakes with roots going back to colonial New England, needed almost nothing to make. Cornmeal, water or milk, a pinch of salt, fried on a hot griddle until the edges crisped. They could be eaten plain with a little butter or with whatever syrup a family had put up that year. And because cornmeal was one of the cheapest and most widely available staples in the country, Johnnycakes appeared on breakfast tables in nearly every region during the hardest years. Sauerkraut and Pork leaned on a technique that predated the Depression by generations, fermenting cabbage into something that would keep through the entire winter without refrigeration. Paired with the cheapest, fattiest scraps of pork available, simmered together until the sharpness of the kraut mellowed and the pork turned tender, it became a heavy, warming dish that German and Eastern European immigrant families had already perfected long before hard times made the technique valuable to everyone else, too. Applesauce cake solved the same problem Depression cake did, a dessert built without eggs, using homegrown or simply bruised, unsellable apples cooked down into sauce. The moisture from the applesauce did the work eggs would normally do, and a little cinnamon and clove made the whole kitchen smell like something worth celebrating, even on a week when there was nothing in particular to celebrate. It was proof that a dessert did not need to be expensive to be genuinely good. By 1933, the federal government began distributing surplus commodities directly to families on relief, flour, cornmeal, dried beans, rice, and powdered milk handed out through local relief offices. This is where the vocabulary of commodity cooking was born. Plain government-issued cheese, government flour, government beans, words that would echo through American kitchens for decades to come. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works its way into how an entire generation understood what a pantry was supposed to contain. Land-grant universities and their cooperative extension offices played a much larger role in the Depression kitchen than most people realize today. Home economists mailed out mimeographed bulletins full of low-cost menus built around beans, cornmeal, potatoes, cabbage, and variety meats, teaching nutrition alongside thrift. These were not vague suggestions. They were detailed, tested recipes distributed for free to any household that wrote in asking for help stretching a grocery budget that had shrunk by nearly half. None of this thrift cooking appeared out of nowhere in 1929. During the First World War, government campaigns urged households to observe wheatless Mondays and meatless Tuesdays, training an entire generation of homemakers in the art of substitution. Many of the same women running a kitchen during the Depression had already practiced these exact skills 15 years earlier. The Depression did not invent frugal cooking. It simply demanded that women use, every single day, what they had only practiced occasionally before. There was never one single Depression menu. In Appalachia, families leaned on foraged greens and soup beans grown on hillside plots. In the Midwest, cream and noodle casseroles carried German and Scandinavian immigrant technique into English-speaking households. Southern tables held cornbread, collards, and whatever hog had been slaughtered that fall. In cities, Italian, Jewish, and German-American communities each stretched their own traditional dishes in ways that looked nothing alike but solved exactly the same problem, feeding a family on almost nothing. Home canning rates climbed sharply during the Depression, and this mattered more than it might seem. A surprising amount of the produce on a Depression-era table was not fresh at all. It was a family's own harvest from the previous summer, sealed into glass jars and stored in a root cellar or under the stairs. A single afternoon of canning tomatoes or green beans in August could mean the difference between a full pantry and an empty one come February. Canned and processed goods were not shunned out of pride, they were embraced because they made sense. Evaporated milk in particular became a genuine Depression kitchen staple, shelf-stable, often cheaper per use than fresh cream, and it found its way into coffee, into gravies, into puddings, into nearly everything that called for dairy. It disappeared from most modern grocery habits, but it still works exactly the way it did in 1932, and plenty of families kept a can in the cupboard for decades afterward out of pure habit. It is worth pausing here because it is easy to imagine the Depression kitchen as a place of constant grinding starvation, and that is not quite accurate. Outside the very worst pockets of unemployment and the hardest-hit rural regions, most working families were eating less meat, less dairy, and far more starch than before. But they were eating. The defining feature of this era was not the total absence of food. It was constant, exhausting, resourceful stretching, day after day, for years. It is also worth saying plainly that these dishes were not universally miserable. Home economists and family memory both tell the same story. Real skill went into these kitchens. Caramelizing onions low and slow to build flavor without spending money, toasting flour before adding it to gravy to deepen the taste, rendering fat carefully instead of wasting a drop of it. When you could not rely on quantity or expensive ingredients, flavor had to come from technique, and Depression-era cooks became remarkably good at exactly that. Decades later, one woman brought this exact world back into focus for a modern audience. Clara Canucciari, born in 1915, grew up in an Italian-American household during the hardest years of the Depression, and in 2007, her grandson began filming her cooking the very dishes she had learned as a girl. Her poor man's meal, her dandelion salad, her pasta with peas, all of it came directly from memory, from a kitchen that existed nearly a century before the camera ever turned on. The Works Progress Administration sent writers across the country between 1936 and 1940 to collect ordinary people's life stories, and food came up constantly. Homemakers described, in their own words, exactly how they stretched a week's groceries, what they fed their children when the cupboard was nearly bare, and which dishes their own mothers had taught them years before. These recordings and transcripts still exist today, a genuine record of a kitchen most of us will never get to stand inside. Just as the worst years of the Depression eased, World War II brought sugar rationing in 1942 and meat, butter, and canned goods rationing in 1943, which meant an entire generation of homemakers never actually got a real break from stretching a kitchen. The habits built between 1929 and the end of the war were not a decade-long adjustment. They were closer to 15 unbroken years of practice, which is exactly why they ran so deep into post-war family cooking. By the late 1940s, when processed convenience foods began arriving on grocery shelves, Depression recipes did not simply disappear. Many quietly evolved instead. Chipped beef on toast reappeared at post-war potlucks. Hamburger stretcher casseroles became a staple of the 1950s dinner table, and mock dishes gave way to new casseroles built on canned soup. The thrift never really left the American kitchen. It just changed its costume for a more prosperous decade. Because meat had been the single most expensive item on any grocery list for 2 decades running, the techniques for stretching it never lost their value. Adding oats or breadcrumbs to ground meat, serving smaller portions alongside a much larger helping of vegetables or starch, saving bones for broth instead of throwing them away, these were not passing habits of hardship. They were permanent lessons that shaped how an entire generation of American women thought about a dinner plate for the rest of their lives. Hunger during these years was not an abstract statistic. It was visible on city streets every single day. In November of 1930, a soup kitchen opened on Chicago's South State Street, serving coffee, bread, and soup to thousands of people at its peak, a stark daily reminder of how many families had nothing at all. Scenes like this one, repeated in cities across the country, are exactly why home-stretching recipes were not a curiosity, they were survival, practiced quietly in millions of kitchens at the same time. For families in the Dust Bowl regions of Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas, the hardship of the Depression was compounded by years of drought and soil erosion that destroyed entire harvests. Kitchens in these households often had even less to work with than their counterparts elsewhere in the country, which pushed dishes like potato soup, cornmeal mush, and beans even further into the center of daily life, sometimes served at every single meal for weeks at a stretch. Immigrant households often weathered the Depression with techniques they had already brought from Italy, Germany, Poland, and Eastern Europe, places where stretching a meal was not new hardship but inherited memory. Pasta with peas, cabbage and noodles, sauerkraut and pork. These dishes did not appear because of the Depression. They simply became more visible as families across the country adopted the same resourceful habits that immigrant kitchens had practiced for generations already. It is fair to say the real health risk of the Depression era was not the substitution techniques themselves, most of which relied on genuinely nutrient-dense staples like beans, cornmeal, potatoes, and organ meats. The risk was insufficient quantity and a lack of variety in the poorest households, particularly a shortage of fresh produce during the leanest winter months, which extension agents and public health workers worked hard to address through their bulletins and community programs. Chow-Chow, a relish made from the last green tomatoes and cabbage of the season before the first frost, let a household preserve an entire garden's worth of odds and ends in one afternoon of chopping and canning. Spooned over beans or cornbread through the winter, it added brightness and acidity to meals that could otherwise turn monotonous week after week, and it cost almost nothing beyond the vinegar and a few spices from the pantry. To understand exactly how tight these budgets were, consider that a loaf of bread ran around 7 to 9 cents in the early 1930s, a dozen eggs cost roughly 20 to 29 cents, and a pound of hamburger meat was about 11 to 15 cents. On an income that had fallen by nearly half for many families, every one of those cents required a decision, and a good homemaker was making dozens of those decisions before breakfast was even on the table. Hoover Gravy was the thinnest cousin of Hoover Stew, little more than flour browned in a dry skillet, whisked with water into a gravy, and poured over whatever bread or biscuit was left in the house. It carried the same mocking name, aimed at a president families held responsible for the crash, and it stands today as one of the clearest reminders of exactly how little some households had to work with during the very worst years of the era. Even in the leanest years, Sunday dinner held onto its shape as something a little more special than the rest of the week. A family might not have a roast, but they would have baked beans that had cooked all morning, or a stretched meatloaf sliced carefully to look generous, or mock apple pie set proudly in the center of the table. The ritual of a proper Sunday meal mattered as much as the food itself, a small, deliberate act of normalcy inside a genuinely hard decade. As unemployment climbed, city and suburban families increasingly turned vacant lots and backyards into what were called relief gardens, growing their own vegetables to reduce grocery spending to almost nothing during the growing season. These gardens were the direct predecessor to the Victory Gardens of World War II, and the produce from a single well-tended plot could feed a family through the summer, and once canned, well into the following winter as well. Bread and gravy, in one form or another, appeared on more Depression-era tables than almost any other combination. A little fat rendered from bacon or sausage, flour whisked in and browned, milk or water added slowly until it thickened, poured generously over sliced bread or biscuits. It was inexpensive, it was filling, and it demonstrated something that runs through nearly every dish on this list, that fat and starch, handled with care, could make an empty-feeling stomach feel genuinely satisfied. Sugar was one of the first luxuries to disappear from a tight Depression budget, which is exactly why sorghum and molasses show up again and again across this list. Both were cheaper, both could sometimes be produced at home or bought in bulk from a neighbor who pressed their own cane, and both gave a family the sweetness they craved without the expense of refined white sugar shipped in from a factory. Most Depression-era households did not yet have electric refrigeration, relying instead on an icebox cooled by a block of ice delivered regularly, or simply a cool cellar shelf. This meant meal planning had to account for spoilage constantly, which is part of why one-pot meals like soup and stew were so common. They could sit safely for a day or two and simply be reheated, stretching a single cooking effort across several meals without waste. Pause for a moment and notice the pattern running underneath every single one of these dishes. Nothing here relied on luck or scarcity alone. Each one relied on a woman's judgment: when to add the vinegar, how long to render the fat, how thin the gravy needed to be to stretch across one more meal. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, a body of kitchen knowledge built entirely on skill, timing, and patience rather than on money. None of this would have worked without cast iron. A single well-seasoned skillet could fry potatoes for breakfast, sear liver for dinner, and bake cornbread the next morning, all without needing to be replaced or repaired for decades. Cast iron held heat evenly, cost little once purchased, and outlived the woman who first bought it, often passed down to a daughter who used the very same pan to cook the very same stretched meals a generation later. Depression era, thrift was rarely a solitary effort. Neighbors traded eggs for flour, shared a hog butchering across 3 or 4 families so no single household had to bear the full cost, and passed along canning jars, recipes, and even meals during the hardest stretches. A pot of soup might feed one family on Monday and a neighboring family on Tuesday, an informal safety net built entirely out of kitchens helping kitchens. Children were not spectators in this kitchen, they were workers. A child old enough to hold a basket was foraging dandelion greens, a child old enough to stir was tending the mush on the stove, and a child old enough to read was sometimes sent to copy down a neighbor's recipe by hand because the family had no cookbook of their own. This is part of why these dishes carried forward so strongly. An entire generation learned them not by watching, but by doing. In New England, baked beans and brown bread, steamed rather than baked, remained a Saturday night tradition carried straight through the Depression from colonial roots. The dish required almost no active cooking time once it was assembled, freeing a household for the rest of a Saturday's chores while a pot of beans quietly finished in a low oven, ready to serve that evening and again after church the next day. Nothing on a Depression-era table was considered finished until it was completely gone. A roast, on the rare week one appeared, became sandwiches the next day, then a hash the day after that, then finally bones for soup by the end of the week. This was not a special technique reserved for hard times. It was simply how food was treated as valuable, an attitude that many home cooks who grew up in this era carried with them for the rest of their lives, long after money stopped being quite so tight. What comes through most clearly in the WPA interviews and in family memory passed down since is not despair, but resolve. Homemakers describe these years matter-of-factly as a job to be done, a puzzle to be solved every single day with whatever pieces happen to be available. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, that resourcefulness itself could be a form of quiet dignity, practiced 3 times a day at a stove that never really stopped working. This body of recipes has resurfaced more than once since the 1930s ended. The 2008 recession brought a wave of renewed interest in Depression-era cooking, as households facing their own tight budgets searched out the same beans, the same stretched meatloaf, the same one-pot soups their great-grandmothers had relied on decades earlier. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works, and every generation that rediscovers it seems a little surprised at how well it holds up. That pattern has only grown stronger in recent years. As grocery prices climbed sharply in the early 2020s, a new wave of households turned back to exactly these techniques, stretching ground meat with oats, cooking a pot of beans instead of buying meat every night, saving bones for broth instead of tossing them out. The specific dollar amounts have changed enormously since the 1930s, but the underlying math, doing more with less, has never actually gone out of style. Foraging, once purely a matter of survival, has quietly become a hobby again in recent years, with dandelion greens and other wild plants showing up in home gardening circles and farmers' markets. It is worth remembering, though, that for a Depression-era homemaker this was never a lifestyle choice or a trend to try once. It was simply Tuesday, one more ordinary task standing between her family and an empty dinner table. Almost a century has now passed since the crash of 1929, and the generation that actually stood at these stoves is nearly gone. What remains are the WPA interviews, the extension bulletins tucked away in university archives, the handful of recorded voices like Clara Canucciari's, and the fragments handed down informally, a grandmother's method for gravy, a great-aunt's trick with cabbage, remembered by a granddaughter who never wrote it down either. These 30 dishes were never really about deprivation, not underneath the surface. They were about a generation of women who refused to let circumstance decide what their families would eat, who treated a nearly empty cupboard as a problem worth solving with skill rather than despair. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget, and every one of these recipes is proof that resourcefulness, applied with enough care, can look almost exactly like abundance. It is easy from almost 100 years away to see these recipes only as historical curiosities, something to admire from a safe distance. But the instinct behind them, stretch what you have, waste nothing, let patience do the work money cannot, is not actually gone. It is still sitting quietly in a lot of kitchens today, in the grandmother who saves bacon grease in a tin, in the pot of soup that starts with leftover bones, waiting for someone to notice it was there all along. If any of these 30 dishes reminded you of something your own mother or grandmother used to make, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and every story you share helps keep a little more of it from disappearing for good. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I will see you in the next one.